Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The first story is about synthetic cells. Scientists have developed a synthetic cell that can react to external stimuli very much like real cells. The basic building blocks of all living organisms are cells. These build up into tissues, then organs, and then systems. Ultimately, a whole being. The problem with synthetic cells so far is that they have generally been one-trick ponies, able to perform a single task and unable to respond to any other possible stimulus. This means they lack the utility of a normal living cell. The particular study that has done this was only able to respond to a single particular signal, that being calcium. In response, the cells would begin to excrete a fluorescent protein. It is a proof of principle study that shows that artificial cells can be made in such a way that they can respond to the environment as it changes. This will be important in the future as we work our way towards better delivery mechanisms where cells could play a part and allow bypassing or use of otherwise innate carriers, gateways, channels, and receptors. An example of this comes from last week's What Were They Thinking, where dyes were created that could respond to different biological measurements. In theory, those dyes could be implanted in these cells where they could recycle or excrete them as needed in response to those changes in the chemical makeup of the human body. That would mitigate the problem of many being irreversible and, as a consequence, relatively permanent and impotent tattoos. In less medically relevant and groundbreaking research, some British scientists have decided to make their own vodka from grains grown in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. They have aptly named it atomic vodka. This may make you think immediately of the possibility of radioactivity lingering around the distilled product. The lead developer of this, Professor Jim Smith, has stated that through aggressive testing, they can state with absolute certainty the vodka is free of radioactivity, and it is the bottle, as only one exists at present. This idea is interesting for several reasons. One is that it demonstrates Chernobyl's exclusion area is more a safety measure than a necessity. Second to that, the researchers behind it plan to use profits from the sale of their atomic vodka, if it clears the appropriate channels and government hurdles, to fund conservation efforts around the former Chernobyl site. It's also intended to help those who were forcefully relocated from those areas that were considered too contaminated and are at present unable to fund themselves through agriculture. This product would, at least in theory, prove that there is some use for what can be produced in that area and allow those who live there to make a more sustainable and hopefully successful living. The next piece of news is largely medical and relates to celiac disease. There is a good chance, based on current clinical trial results, that there may be a blood test available in the near future to identify this autoimmune disease. Celiac disease is difficult to diagnose and can take up to 4 years, with some of the tests becoming very invasive. If there is a viable blood test that could be used to do this instead, it would streamline the process and mitigate much of the patient discomfort. In this specific case, there's a good chance that there is an immune marker in the blood of nearly all participants examined so far that will help with identifying their condition. The trials so far have used a single-dose challenge, where participants were given a large dose of gluten equivalent to either 25 or 50% of the daily intake of a normal person. Within 2 hours of receiving this dose of gluten, there was an increase in several cytokines in the blood, 2 of which were relevant, interleukin-8 and interleukin-2. Interleukin-2 is the more significant option, as it reached the highest level first and showed the most association severity of symptoms, such as nausea and vomiting. These promising results are slightly tainted by the fact that a number of the researchers are tied into a private interest in developing a vaccine, specifically one that uses peptides for celiac disease. However, based on the initial results, where it was done and how it was done, there is a good chance that at least a blood identification screening for celiacs could be in the works very soon, and not necessarily as restrictive as a private interest might wish. The next piece of news is regarding Neil deGrasse Tyson's faux pas. Following the recent tragedies in America, he wrote about the number of people who would die to mass shootings, and then made the unfortunate error of claiming that 500 people died due to medical errors in the same time frame. He was quickly criticized for this at the time for both being insensitive and in error. And whilst the sensitivity issue is one of significance, the fact is someone who is, historically at least, a major scientific communicator has failed to present both accurate and properly contextualized statistics. In fact, he was almost immediately called out on this as well by Hank Green. To provide some context, this number comes from a 1999 Institute of Medicine report that found 98,000 people were dying in United States hospitals each year. They put it down due to preventable medical errors. Unfortunately, this was an aggregate number, and, as a result, was widely disputed. The dispute arises from the fact that the number says that the deaths were due to medical errors, although that does not necessarily mean that doctors, surgeons, or other staff were directly associated with the death. In fact, once you start to adjust for the baseline rate of death within a hospital, due to the fact that they are generally sick people and more likely to die, adjusting for this fact and the baseline rate of death without known medical errors, the difference is practically negligible. As this study at the time was controversial, other studies have followed, and they have found varying numbers, but nothing on par with that. There has been an estimate of between 5 and 20% at the extreme end. This is because many of the 98,000 identified were a failure to recognize or diagnose a condition before someone died, an adverse reaction to something that wasn't known until after they had died, or other factors that were simply not associated with any action that a doctor had taken. Rather, it was a lack of action, lack of knowledge, or lack of diagnoses. Neil deGrasse Tyson followed up with this in a somewhat insincere apology for what he has described a true but unhelpful tweet. It is true in so much as there is a number. It is not true in that the number reflects a factual basis or any current evidence. This takes it from being simply unhelpful to damaging to both the medical community and public confidence in the medical system. More so when you consider that anti-vaxxers rely heavily on figures like this when they argue the medical system kills more than it saves. The next story adds to why humans should not have anything to do with animals, adding to other stories like Hout's treatment of her dog is a woman who decided to face-hug an octopus. A lady who was fishing managed to catch an octopus. When she decided she was going to eat it for dinner, she had to pose for a photo first. Her photo was putting the octopus to her face so that it wrapped its tentacles around her head. Unfortunately for her, she seemed to be ignorant of the fact that octopuses actually have rather nasty beaks. And yes, they have a beak. That in this case led to a rather obvious series of injuries when it decided to nom on her face. There's a sweet irony in that. You should understand that octopuses will quite happily eat anything they can get their tentacles on. This goes from the rather squishy fish all the way through to armored crabs, and their beaks will break them open. Unfortunately for this idiot, it was going to get worse other than just being bitten by the octopus. It has venom. Venom it injected as it bit down into her face. This led to her bleeding for about 30 minutes. As a sign of how brilliantly she deals with animals, she waited several days to go to hospital and receive treatment for the extreme swelling the venom had caused. Doctors have given her antibiotics, and she appears to have recovered. However, the doctors have warned her the swelling may come and go for some time yet. In another brilliant example of people who really should not have dealings with animals, an unfortunate Ohio woman has had to have part of her limbs amputated due to allowing her dog to lick an open wound. Most people accept that they should not allow their pets to lick them. There is a good chance that the bacteria they harbor in their mouths will be transmitted, something this woman appears to have now learned. Unfortunately for her, this was only learned after she woke up after having her limbs amputated due to gangrene. In a normal, healthy individual, being licked by your pet would be seen as a form of affection, and would probably not cause any significant health issues. The skin is a very effective barrier to penetration and infection by bacteria. Open wounds are not. This is why dog bites are a significant issue for infection. They generally harbor some of the more unpleasant strains available and lead to complications, such as in this case. Unfortunately for the woman in this particular case, the bacteria she was infected with, called capnocytophagia, can also cause flu-like symptoms, and for this reason she delayed seeking medical care, as she felt it was only the flu. Unfortunately, it was not, and did create deadly complications that could have killed her, rather than severely limited her life. Now for some less depressing news. There is a theory that tardigrades may be alive on the moon at present. Tardigrades are considered bacterial bears and adorable in many cases. They are also one of the hardiest organisms alive. This entire story comes from something mentioned a few weeks back, the Beresheet lunar lander. A private company decided to put a backup of human civilization on this particular lander. It included a drive containing nearly every English Wikipedia page, human DNA, and thousands of tardigrades. As has been mentioned, the Beresheet lander did not necessarily land as intended. In fact, its engines failed and it crashed into the lunar surface. While this story is not on par with the geckos in space, there is a good chance that they will be alive for a time yet. The tardigrades will need access to both water and oxygen to continue surviving, but they may well survive for decades, if not centuries, in a form of suspended animation. This means that there is plenty of time to get there and rescue them. Coming back to Earth, but with an extraterrestrial bend. The Storm Area 51 Facebook page was, for a time, pulled as it was said to violate community standards, according to Facebook. At the time this happened, there were approximately 2 million users who had said that they were intending to take part. Interestingly, when this was taken down, the organizer for the original event decided to organize a festival in place of the assault. That was also taken down. As is often the case with social media and large tech companies, and as most everyone is getting used to, after Facebook decided that it had violated their nebulous terms of service and conditions, they have now decided that it has not violated their terms of service and conditions, attributing the decision as a mistake. It's only after the 20th of September that we will truly know what's going to happen with this particular event, and whether or not 2 million meme lords and other future organ donors will actually show up at Area 51. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.